super happy to be here today with Kale Zelden, who is a new friend that I met on Twitter. And so this is our first time talking together.
Mhm.
And we kind of got connected most recently through a tweet that the Pope had made about social justice, and Jordan Peterson had responded to it in a way that set off kind of a fury. And I don't think it's necessary to maybe go into all of that, but it did bring up a question for me about this whole issue of social justice.
Mhm.
That was the point I was trying to understand with many people in the corner who were upset with Jordan Peterson. And I have my own feelings about the term social justice because for me, it brings up all of the controversy over liberation theology back in the 70s.
Mhm.
And but I wanted to learn from you, Kale, because you're Catholic.
Mhm.
I wanted to learn from you what the Catholic perspective is on social justice, and maybe talk with you a little bit about what you see as the causes of poverty, maybe the root causes of poverty, what can be done about these things. But before we get started, I wonder if you could just give me a little bit of your background so I know a little bit more about you and so my viewers know a little bit more about you.
Sure, sure. I'm 50. I live in Rhode Island. I'm a prep school teacher. I teach English, and I am a cradle Catholic. I was raised. My mom and dad are both devout people. I how would I put this? I sort of left my childhood faith for a couple of years in late high school, and I read my way back into the faith in early college, primarily through an encounter with um, uh, the Greeks. It wasn't really so much reading Homer and Aristotle that did it. It was just a recognition that there was a whole body of knowledge that I had sort of arrogantly dismissed as even being possible. So I was really deep, deep, deep into the kind of ambient progressive myth that I grew up with. As some people in this little corner will say, we were raised by the set, and I certainly was no exception to that. Even though I was also raised as a fairly fairly conservative Catholic in Catholic South Louisiana, which is where I was born in New Orleans and grew up in Baton Rouge. So yeah, so the my background is that. So anyway, because I realized that I didn't really know anything, I kind of did a deep dive in the great books, um and as I sort of made this sort of intellectual pilgrimage, there was a sort of an accompanying spiritual pilgrimage, so that by the time I was, I don't know, let's call it 2021, I was a pretty devout, as devout as one can be, I guess, in college. And but serious, I was serious about practicing my faith, and serious about at least trying to practice my faith. And I was intellectually convinced that the church, as I understood it, but the Christianity was true, and it rendered sort of the best explanation as to why the world is as it is. And honestly, I've continued to read deeply, and to in a variety of different ways and subjects and perspectives, and I still remain a faithful believer, and I think it still gives us the best explanation. Sometimes the details are to be argued about, but I would say that certainly in this sort of phase of my life, I'm a firm believer in Lewis's Mere Christianity as a sort of a baseline.
Yeah, that was certainly foundational for me in my
Mhm.
early walk, which was
Mhm.
I became a Christian in 1980.
Yeah.
I was already 32 years old at the time. So,
Were you raised just in a secular home or
yes,
a?
yeah,
Okay, okay.
completely secular home.
Mhm.
I mean, they weren't militantly atheist or anything, but
Right.
there was no, I didn't know anything.
Yeah. And was this
And
out in California, Karen, or?
no, no, no. my father was in the military, so I sort of
Okay,
lived everywhere
got it.
until he retired when I was 9, and then we moved to Minnesota. So I
Oh,
went
okay.
through the rest of elementary and high school in
Mhm.
Minnesota. And then after that, I ended up living in Iowa, which is where I became a Christian.
Okay, okay.
Um, but for the people who don't inhabit this little corner who might
Mhm.
stumble on our talk here, what did you mean when you said raised by the set?
Well, I think that's something I picked up from Grimm, I guess, Grimm
Yeah,
Grizz.
yeah. I
Just
just
the
want you to
idea.
tell people what it
Yeah,
means.
yeah. So, and he can correct us in the comments. But I always take Grimm to mean that whatever our sort of home script was, whatever our locale was, I was raised by watching Who's the Boss. I was raised by watching the Happy Days, and when we got cable in 1983 or 82, I was raised by watching episodes of Leave It to Beaver, and raised by watching music videos on MTV, and I was raised by Saturday morning cartoons, and I was raised by all those sorts of things. I was certainly raised by Steven Spielberg. I was certainly raised by Indiana Jones and Star Wars. Oh my gosh, that was such a huge part of what raised me. And so you imbibe those default assumptions about life way in a way more, I think, compelling way than the catechism that I was born in. Now, and I should say, and this is not to throw my parents under the bus, but the Catholicism, for instance, let's say that my mom grew up in. She was born in the during at the end of the war, and so her heavy, sort of thick Catholic upbringing was old school. They did the Baltimore Catechism, and she went to school with nuns, and so her appreciation of what the faith was very thick, I would say, and it was sort of thickly coherent. Um, and when by the time I am in grade school, because my parents sent us to Catholic schools, the council had happened, right? And so the Second Vatican Council
Second
had
Vatican.
really sort of changed the way the church sort of saw itself and saw its business. And so I was raised in a much less uh, explicitly catechistic environment. I was very much more raised in that kind of 70s, early 80s ethos of, for lack of a better way. So sort of kind of hippie Jesus, felt banners and kumbaya and guitar masses and that sort of thing. And so my parents didn't, I think, fully understand that what we were getting at school was just not really the same thing. It didn't have the same kind of coherence. And so part of the reason why I left the faith is that it just struck me as a fairly precocious, but definitely arrogant, you know, 10th grader, 15-year-old, that all this stuff was stupid, and that Christians were stupid, and that they weren't sophisticated like the people that I looked up to, which were rock stars and movie stars, and that sort of thing. And again, this was never anything that I was sort of consciously aware of. It was just sort of what it came to be. And so then whenever there was any kind of friction between, so let's say, what the church was teaching me versus what I see modeled for me in pop culture, it just wasn't even a contest. And so I very arrogantly dismissed my parents in that regard. I mean, I still had a good relationship with them, but I just didn't see the there. And so so when I left sort of what I thought was sort of dumb and shallow and almost kind of like Mr. Rogersy or something like that. Not to I like Mr. Rogers fine, but it was that sort of that nice thing. And
Mhm.
so when I encountered the reality that for the greater part of the last couple of thousand years, it wasn't until the last couple of hundred that everybody believed in Christianity, and including in those people were really, really smart people, and so that was a real watershed moment. And then it was a moment in class. I was a freshman at LSU, and we just got finished reading Homer's Iliad, and and I loved it. I had a great teacher, and he was fantastic. Later on, I found out that he was he was a Christian himself, but a man really steeped in the tradition. And he made this pronouncement, that he said something like, you know, um, the Iliad is a true achievement in the history of mankind, and we have never surpassed its greatness. We have equaled it on a couple of occasions, but we have never surpassed it in its achievement. And I knew what he was talking about, and I knew that he was right. And it really, really bothered me that he was right, because how can it be that something that is thousands of years old have not been surpassed? I mean, we have remote controls, we have we have TV, and and all those sorts of things. And so it really rocked my kind of bedrock faith that I had kind of imbibed in the myth of progress. We used to sort of joke, oh, come on, man, it's like it's the 90s, in 1990. And it's like, so what, and so that really reoriented my whole so I had to confront the fact that I knew nothing, and that there were lots and lots of smart people that had preceded me, and they were really smart, and they bought this whole Jesus thing, so that if I was going to dismiss it, I had to really kind of do my homework. And so that was what, and I would argue, sort of go back to your original question, that the reason why I had been so grossly ignorant is that because I had allowed myself to be raised by well, I guess what we might call in this little corner, I had allowed myself to be raised by spirits of which I was unaware of as even being spirits. So television, pop culture, movies, radio, all that sort of stuff.
Well, yeah. And I mean, at the time, you probably had no idea that you were being arrogant. And your parents probably had no idea what was going on inside your head, because there is just this difficulty of having lucid, deep, meaningful conversations when teenagers are teenagers, and between teenagers and their parents. So they probably didn't even know, they probably had no idea that this new move in the church was leaving you without a foundation.
Well, I remember it to that effect. So my mom was a smart, is a very smart woman, and deeply, deeply immersed in scripture. Counter to sort of the stereotype about Catholics. My mom sort of certainly breaks those kind of stereotypes for two reasons, or three reasons. She's an Orthodox Catholic who like goes to adoration and goes to mass every day, and she's charismatic. And number three, she's deeply, deeply immersed in scripture. So just having that as a kind of model for me. Now, I didn't know what that meant. You have to understand.
Mhm.
But so she got involved in the charismatic renewal, in the mid 70s. And so that was certainly different. But what she was unaware of was just how much there was sort of two strains that had been going on inside of the church at that time in terms of Catholic schools and universities. Number one was the liberation theology thing, but the other one was sort of this sort of a slightly older tradition, but the modernist tradition. And so, the faith that I got was either inflected by this kind of, what we would call now, or, struggling to define, social justice Catholicism. But it was also one that was very demystified. It was very modernist in its bent, so much so that in one of my textbooks, I think it was my it was my sophomore year of high school, because freshman year was Old Testament in theory, sophomore year was New Testament in theory. But the miracles were characterized, not even characterized, were explicitly said to be mass hypnosis and kind of sort of group like tricks, basically. So there was this
And you
underplay.
were in a Catholic high school.
Yeah, I was in a Catholic high
Wow.
school. Yeah, so you're talking like literally like 1988, 89, thereabout. I graduated high school in 91. And so like, but again, as a kid, I'm like, all right, like whatever, like that's what the textbook says, it says. And I had my best friend was an evangelical Christian, but he was at the Catholic school with me. And he was like losing his mind over this. And I didn't understand what he was losing his mind over, because he was like an evangelical Christian, like took scripture very seriously, was big into C.S. Lewis and Tolkien and all this kind of stuff that I kind of like too, but I didn't have the scripture background that he had. And he's like, what are you talking about? Like the miracles are real. It can't not be real. And so so one day we were just talking, and my mom overheard us talking about religion class, and she just didn't believe that that's what the textbook said. And my friend says, no, Mrs. Zelden, like, look, it's right here. We took out the book, and she was like beside herself. She could not believe that this kind of modernist, I mean, heresies, right, was being passed off in a Catholic school, in a Catholic textbook, as sort of normative. So you can kind of see why somebody like me, I was a little bit more curious than the average bear. I definitely did a lot of reading, that I just saw the whole thing as like, well, this is just some kind of big joke, right? And so then the reason why I left the church in high school was because I sort of did a quick kind of mental calculus, because if they were going to distill the faith down into a kind of, you do you uh, uh, what's the phrase I'm looking for? In other words, like a kind of like a do-gooderism, right? Like, go to a soup kitchen and all of that. Again, obviously nothing wrong with it. It's an important part of our faith. But if that's all it is, then I'll just skip the waking up on Sunday morning bit and just call it a day. And so now I think I would call that a kind of a sort of a early versions of moralistic therapeutic deism. But again, we didn't have that kind of vocabulary then. So for me it was like, well, the whole Jesus thing is a complete joke. I'll just go be a good person on my own time and not really have to bother myself with the sort of the moral or personal elements of these things.
I had my own experience long before I was Christian. When I was in college, I happened to go to a Lutheran college because when I was in high school, my choir director happened to be one of the only kind people I had ever met.
Wow.
and and he was a wonderful choir director, and he had graduated from Concordia College in Moorhead, Minnesota. And so I made it my goal. I want to go to Concordia College and be like my choir director.
Yeah.
And I went to Concordia College. I wasn't a Christian. I didn't have any background at all.
Yeah.
But you had to take a religion class. I was only there one semester because I ran out of money, because I was so dumb. I didn't realize that you had to have a plan for the future. And my parents, I had gotten a scholarship sufficient to pay my first semester, but that was that.
That was it. Yeah.
That was it. And my parents didn't have any money to send me to college. So anyway, I'm here in this first semester, and here's this religion professor, and he's telling us all about the miracles and how they actually can be explained by perfectly scientific means.
Right. Yeah.
So,
that was the script that was throwing it up.
So the crossing of the Red Sea, that was an earthquake that caused the waters to divide, and he just goes through all of them. Mm-hmm. And he's some sort of Hebrew scholar or something. I didn't know what he was talking about. First of all, I didn't have much background in the Bible at all, aside from having been raised by the set of the Ten Commandments movie, and Ben-Hur, and all of that kind of thing. That was my religious background.
Yeah.
But even I felt uncomfortable with that. Not having a religious background. I just thought, well, why are you telling me this? Here you have this religious book that you adhere to. You call yourself one of these people, but then you're trying to find scientific reasons to believe what you believe. It didn't make any sense to me.
Well, because it doesn't, right? I mean, in other words, I don't know if I know you probably watched your fair share of Jonathan Pageau, but I remember one time he was talking to, and again, I don't even remember who he was talking to, but he was talking about, the way that we teach the Bible to kids, and in mainstream capacities, even in formal churches. And he just laughed that you look at like a regular Bible, and I can pull one off right here, but like the NAB or something like that, it's got it has the text, and then it's got all these kind of like these sort of technical notes behind it, and then it has all these sort of series of explanations, which are essentially like saying like, yeah, all the reasons in these footnotes is why you don't have to sort of take that stuff seriously. Like it's a complete taking you out of what a story is meant to do. And the stories, of course, are meant to enchant us. And I mean that in sort of the fullness of that phrase, right? That they're supposed to sort of envelop us in such a way so that you sort of throw yourself into the story. But you have all these sort of footnotes and explanatory things that are essentially saying, yeah, like none of that's real. Right. And so it's so fascinating to me that your reaction to hearing that kind of modernist or neo-modernist approach talk to you by the press. It's like, well, what are you doing? Like, you're what's the basis for belief in any of this?
Well, and the other thing is, so I became a Christian in 1980. I already had one child.
Okay.
So
Okay.
she's she became a Christian the same summer through some things that she heard at summer camp.
Hmm.
So she's going, by the time she was in Sunday school, she was already in fifth grade. So it was considerably more robust. And
Yeah.
I happened to be in a very good church. I was really, really lucky for my
Yeah.
first church. It was a little country church,
Yeah.
but the pastor had been a missionary to the Navajo Indians for 20 years. So he had a deep understanding of reality,
Yeah.
where the
Wow.
rubber
Yeah.
hits the road, sort of,
I
right?
bet. Yeah. I bet.
Um, but then in later years, I just noticed I used to help out with teaching Sunday school. And then later I had another child. And the whole thing with Sunday school, the way that these stories are taught to children, is so watered down.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, and and I started to feel like this is really bad, because what we're really doing is inoculating
That's right.
kids against the Bible. They hear this
Yeah.
simplistic version of some story.
Hmm.
It's like the way that the fairy tales have been redrawn
Yeah.
since Grimm, right? You
That's
take
right.
all the sorrow out of it and all the pain
Right.
and everything. You just have this pretty little thing that you can put on a flannel board.
Hmm.
So by the time they're in high school and you try to tell them something about the Bible, they're like, "Oh, I've been there. I've done that. I
Right.
I know that story." You don't know that story. Like Jordan Peterson can take the
Yeah.
book of Genesis and spend 45 hours laying
Hmm.
out the depths, and he just barely scratched the surface, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, I think the way we educate our children in the churches is a catastrophe.
Well, it's like this. It's like, take a movie, that was really like I watched. Uh, my kids are a little bit older right now. They're in middle school and high school, but I remember, 10 years ago it was, I probably watched with my kids something like Finding Nemo. I don't know, 10, 15 times, right? It's a
Yeah.
wonderful movie. It really, just from a film writing standpoint, a screenplay writing standpoint, they're perfect. Which is something that I anyway, it's perfect and just great storytelling. But it would be like this. Imagine if you and I sat down with our kids to watch Finding Nemo, and after the first um 25 seconds, we pressed pause and we said, okay, kids, now what you're looking at right now is not real. Okay, what it's drawn, it's rendered actually in a thing we call a computer. And the computer, sketches, thousands of frames per second based upon an artist's rendering of the 3D model. Now, you take a really high end graphics card, you can render this almost in real time, giving us the sense that this is a fish who's talking to us. Now, you should know that fish, they don't really talk. Okay. But it is important that you understand that the way in which they got this particular fake fish to talk is they have an actor who is sitting in a soundstage, and in that soundstage, the actor is reading lines that are not even written. This is not what he really thinks. They're actually written by somebody else, and so this actor is voicing this character we call Nemo, and Nemo, you should know, is a reference to this, and going to, and then say, okay, everybody got that, good. Okay, press play again. So we'll press play, and then we'll watch the next minute, and we'll press stop. Like, now, kids, what you have to understand is when Nemo's mother is killed by the barracuda on the like, it's not I know, I'll stop now, but you get the kind of idea. Like, there's it's designed to keep you out of the story, or to use your words, to inoculate you from what the story does in its power. Now, as you know, since you have had children, like, a kid can watch a story again and again and
Yeah.
again,
Yeah.
and there's such an insight. We adults are the ones who get this wrong, right? Because to be able to be moved by Finding Nemo 10, 15, 20 times is in fact the insight. We are the one, we adults are the ones who have the problem, because we are, we need novelty, right? We long for it, but the child knows the good thing when they see the good thing, and they want more of that good thing, and you can keep hitting that good thing. So I think that the way we teach scripture, for instance, is completely backwards. It's almost reverse engineered to get people to not have faith, than it is to sort of to seek some level of understanding. There's sort of this strange separation of understanding and faith that has been ripped apart, I think.
Well, I don't know how you feel about this because I have people from both sides who would attack me for this idea. But I've been in a lot of different kind of churches over the years. And like I said, originally I was in this little country church.
Hmm.
The way
Hmm.
the way that I learned in this little country church, we had, of course, we had church all the time. We had church in the morning, we had church at night on Sunday.
And then
Um,
Wednesday night, you
and
probably
we
had
had
church.
Wednesday night
Yeah.
Bible studies, and then we had small group in our homes. And so, I mean, we were really connected.
Hmm.
And when we would have a Bible study with a small group of people, there would be somebody in the group who was a seasoned Christian, and they would sort of act as a facilitator. They might give a little bit of an introduction to a book, a little bit, but then we would all read the book together. We would read the scriptures together,
Hmm.
and then we would each, it had originally been a Quaker church, which is
Okay.
based on a lot of silence, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But by the time this other pastor had come in, it would be more like what you'd call a Bible church or an evangelical
Yeah.
church.
I follow.
Um, but anyway, some of the old Quakers still had this thing about silence, so they'd give a little bit of an introduction, we'd pray, we'd spend a little time in silence, we would read the book together. And then as thoughts would arise in us, well, the way that this comes to me in my life is this. And then we would talk about the meaning of something, it had this impact on me. I can
Sure.
see how God did this in my life this week. That sounds very much like what's happening here with this Bible character.
Yeah.
And so it was very integrated in our lives. And the conversations were incredibly deep and meaningful. And I just felt like the scriptures got integrated into me that way. Now, later, I went to a Bible church for many years with a lot of very erudite people, and there were a
Sure.
lot of doctors and lawyers and physicists and all kinds of people in the congregation, and the teachers were incredibly intellectual. But the way they did Bible study in small groups is somebody would come in and teach for 45 minutes in the Bible study, and then maybe they'd ask you a few questions at the end, which if you got a little off track from what might be, considered sensible, they'd rein you back into
Sure.
the way you were supposed to answer the questions.
Yeah.
And then maybe there would be 10 minutes of coffee and fellowship or something like that. So
Yeah.
that never did anything for me. Although there are a lot of people who say that there has to be more academic control over how the word gets interpreted versus this idea of just individuals allowing the Holy Spirit to work in them to bring more depth into the study. So I don't know how you think about that.
Well, it's funny. Well, so I've done both of those, right? We have a tradition that comes out of the monasteries called Lectio Divina, which
Mhm,
sounds to me a lot, or at least the version that I've experienced sounds to me a lot like what you were describing in your country church.
mhm,
Whereas you take, let's say let's say you take the parable of the prodigal son, as the text for the day, right? And the way it works is that you read, someone, the group leader reads it out loud, and then you have a set time of silence, right? So you read the parable, and you have, like, 3 minutes, 5 minutes of silence, a good amount, right? An amount of silence that you start getting really kind of uncomfortable, which is sort of, I think, kind of have to pierce through that. And I, of course, struggle with this because I like to talk. And so anyway, you do that, and then you read it again, and then after the second time you read it out loud, you're asked, does anybody, were you struck by anything in that passage? And so you'll kind of go around the room and say, oh, I'm struck by the older brother's response, or why, anyway, you could do, was
mhm.
there a phrase, or anyway, so you go around and you do this like 4 times, and so after about a span, it takes about 45 minutes to do it, but it's very much that it's a kind of unfiltered experience of scripture, sort of in the wild, and there's no, like, orthodoxy check, there's none of that, right? And so I've been through versions of that, and I think that's incredibly impactful. But then I think there's also a place for that kind of more of a class, is sort of what you're describing to me, which
Mhm.
is a master teacher is sort of taking you through a text and taking you out of the text sometimes to take a look at this thing and then kind of putting you back in. And so I think that that can be, I think both are kind of necessary. I mean, I think that kind of intimacy that you responded to is so important, because so many of us aren't comfortable in that kind of intimate relationship to scripture, that it's sort of like, what is this weird thing that I'm doing? And so I would recommend more of that. I think that we need more of that, minus the sort of the voice of the expert, and letting, having a kind of faith that the scripture can kind of, the Holy Spirit can work on you, the experiencer, in the midst of a group of people gathered in his name, right? So I think that there's a richness to that probably needs to happen, way more than it is happening now. That's for sure.
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, I think there does need to be somebody in the group that can keep you from wandering off into heresy, which,
Yeah,
which I was fortunate to have.
yeah.
But this is really rich. We could go on this way for the whole
Mhm,
time, but since
mhm,
I roped you into this because I wanted to talk to you about
mhm,
um, poverty and social justice,
mhm.
um, well, before we get started, let
Yep.
me let me read the tweet that you put out today. Oh no, I just lost it again. There it is. Apparently, Pope Francis tweeted again. His previous tweet was about hashtag social justice,
Right.
and he made some comments about social justice that sort of set off Jordan Peterson. And I think Jordan Peterson got set off strictly because of the terminology of social
Mhm,
justice. I think that terminology triggered him the same way it triggers me.
mhm.
Um,
And
but
I
I
should
don't
point
know
out,
what Pope Francis meant by it, or
yeah,
whoever manages his account.
right. And yeah, and maybe that's something we can get into, and even more. The name of the Twitter account is called Pontifex, right? The Pontiff, the bridge was kind of what that means. But he doesn't work his own Twitter feed, right? The
Mhm.
Twitter feed is the Pope. Maybe this is sort of a Vanderclayism or something, but like the Pope is not just the Pope, right? It yes, he's a person. His name is, his last name is Bergoglio, and his assumed name when he became the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church is Francis, the first of his name. Um, uh, you know, he's also the Pope, capital T, capital P, the Pope, right? So if you would have, if you and I had run into the street 20 years ago, we might say that the Pope is saying X, Y, and Z. At the time, the Pope was John Paul II. 12 years ago, the Pope was Benedict the 16th. Street name Ratzinger, right? So, so that there's that part. Like, in other words, there's the office of the Pope, and then there's the assumed name of the person who is sitting in the seat of Saint Peter. Again, according to Roman Catholic theology. So there are these kind of layers to this, right? There's the Pope that you and I might run into if we walked into the room with him. There's this person, and he's wearing a white robe, and then there's the Pope that you see on at an audience or at a mass at St. Peter's. And then there's the Pope that's on the TV screen. There's the Pope of the Twitter, et cetera. And so that there's it's a sort of a super entity that is more than just who he is in his particularity. So, like, when Paul asked me the other day, would the Pope have an audience with Jordan Peterson, and I immediately reacted, like, well, no, of course he wouldn't. Even if the Pope were like favorable towards somebody like Jordan Peterson, the Pope is like a whole system. You know what I mean? Like, he's this sort of this super being, and I don't mean this in any kind of I'm not being a Catholic sort of homer here. I just mean like just the reality of the Pope. It's like the president. It's like, the king. And so, the medievals had this notion of the king's two bodies that I think might be helpful in this conversation. But basically, that the king was John, and John was a man, right? But the king also represented the body politic, right? So that is a sort of a stand-in. So that the king's two bodies was sort of something recognizable, that the king is never just the king, right? The king is also the king, and so the pope is never just the pope. The pope is also the pope. And so I think a lot of what, now this kind of language probably is meaningless to people outside of the Catholic worldview. It certainly would be kind of meaningless to somebody like Jordan Peterson, because remember Peterson's whole shtick. And it's more than that. I'm a fan. I'm sure people on Twitter will remind me of this all the time. I'm a fanboy, apparently. But his thing, right, is to sort of live this radically integrated singularity of uh, of um, of integrity, right? The and I listened to your conversation with Gavin Ashenden, and it's a great conversation, and I want to give you a serious shout out for like sticking with the conversation, because I think there was a sort of a little mini drama in that show, which I
Yeah.
think goes to what you're trying to suss out here, Karen, which is you know you he thought he was hearing a thing, and he was already like sort of pre-worked up about the thing that he thought you were giving air to. And you let him speak, and you let him do his thing. You say, well, I want to push back a little bit, like that's not what, this is what I'm saying. And then what was amazing in that conversation you had with him is that, I don't know, I don't exactly know the minute point at which you sort of broke down the he kind of got his back up. Then you had this beautiful conversation about the power of witnessing to Christ, to a hurting world. I mean, again, I don't know how much you remember the conversation, but just this beautiful witness to the power of prayer and personal praying over people, and how the gospel can change your life. And it was really a wonderful conversation. But I think what Gavin saw in the tweet, what you saw in the tweet, I think because I think I'm basically on team Karen here, is that this useful club that people use, a club like as in like a hammer, like is this very useful hammer which is used to denude Christianity of its radical existential call to personal holiness, right, as a stand-in, and so instead of that, it becomes a kind of political program, and a political program that would provide cover for those people who would, contra Solzhenitsyn, allow you to live by lies. And, as someone who's watched Peterson for a really long time, nothing is his whole sort of second career as a sort of public intellectual was started on his unwillingness to live by lies, or to be compelled to live by a lie. And so to me, when I saw Peterson go after the Pope using, hashtag social justice, I think he was responding to the way in which that kind of stuff is used and weaponized against, whatever the forces of our better angels or something like that. So that's how I heard that tweet, and that's what I saw from the Pope, or from the Pope's account. And then when I saw Jordan Peterson's reaction, I was like, that to me is what he was reacting to. And now that doesn't mean I don't have a whole critique of Jordan Peterson's sort of focus on individualism over and against sort of community. But I don't hear in Jordan Peterson that same kind of inability to recognize the reality of community that I see in some of the kind of voices of hyper individualism. Because if you look at kind of liberalism, right, sort of this large political project roughly since 1700, right, John Locke and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that sort of that vision of liberalism is hyper individual and is sort of a problem, certainly in the context of historical Christian faith. But I think the church's response needs to be how to, I don't know, cultivate a better balance between the collective over and against the individual. Because when I growing up, or now even so, when I hear people talk about the collective or some kind of socialism or something like that, I see those as the mechanisms by which individual people were ground into submission and into pain. And I can't not hear that. And knowing enough about Jordan Peterson's perspective and the genesis of his own intellectual project, I think he probably hears the same thing.
Well, I do want to talk about that whole thing about individualism, because I think that's a really interesting aspect of the conversation, um, that will get us back eventually to the actual Catholic thinking about
Mhm.
the work of social justice within the church.
Right.
But before we do, I want to go back and ask you about
Mhm.
this idea of the Pope as I guess you could say he's a symbol of something larger.
Yep.
But that symbol, as you said, exists in media and in the news and in people's minds and hearts and but to what extent when and leave aside the Pope's Twitter feed, but
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
say the Pope's proclamations, his periodic, when he just says something, if he's talking to a newsman, for
Mhm.
example, to what extent are his thoughts, can they be considered his own personal thoughts as Monsieur Bergoglio, and to what extent are they considered to be a proclamation of the church at large? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a great question. Okay, so Karen, you're an evangelical. Is that roughly speaking correct? How would I characterize you if that already
Yeah,
started
I
asking?
mean, I guess I've been in and out of churches that would be considered charismatic or
Mhm.
evangelical or
Mhm.
reformed. I've been through a lot of different churches.
Mhm.
I have a center. My center is Christ,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
and so more and more I'm very intrigued by both Catholicism and Orthodox Christianity.
Sure.
And so I would say my personal practice would probably lean more in that direction.
Sure. Okay.
But I
Okay.
but I do still attend an evangelical church, which is, well, it's a Presbyterian adjacent church, so it probably swings a little bit more towards Reformed.
Yeah. Okay. So you are blissfully unaware of the war that is going on in Catholicism as we speak.
I'm a
The
little bit aware because of hearing news here and there about, I mean,
Yeah.
I watch your Twitter feed and
Yeah.
others,
So
the issue around the abuse from the past and how that's impacted where things are going today.
right. So
And
you could yeah, so
some
you've
of
got a
the,
couple so you've got a bunch of moving parts here right now. But so the two previous popes, Benedict XVI, Cardinal Ratzinger, and then prior to him was John Paul II, Cardinal Wojtyla. Um, they so I'm trying to think the best way to sort of to get at this. All right, yeah, I'll start with okay. So Pope Francis is different in some peculiar ways to the two prior popes.
I've noticed
Uh,
that. I mean,
yeah,
I've watched the news for many years, so yeah.
yeah. So So, and I think one of the tells, and this is not the only tell, and maybe I'll get in trouble here, but I think you'll probably understand what I'm telling you because you said you watch the news. The way in which this pope is covered by the mainstream press versus the way that the prior two popes were covered by the mainstream press, I think is a tell of some sort. It's not the only thing, but it is certainly a tell. And I would say that the rough strokes of it are like this. Um, we like Francis, we did not like Benedict, and we did not like really Wojtyła or John Paul II. We like Francis because Francis seems more open to being like us, which is being weird in that, what is it, Western, you know what I'm talking about, the acronym.
No, I haven't heard that acronym.
Hold on.
For a minute, I thought you meant it for real. And what?
So I always get this wrong, but there's a book by Joseph Henrich. It's called "The Weirdest People in the World," and it's how the West became psychologically peculiar and particularly prosperous. But the weird stands for, gosh, I should know this off the top of my head. I'm sorry, but I think it's worth this having this conversation. Okay, but the weirdest people in the world are us, right? Uh, Oh, geez, I'm gonna kill this poor podcast. I'm so sorry, Karen. Um, it's Western. Geez, Western.
Well, do you want to take a break and look it up? Let's
Yeah, can you give me just give
put
me
it
two
on pause.
seconds?
Yeah.
Ready?
Yep.
So by weird, he means Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, right? And so the Pope, our current Pope, seems to be the most cozy with the weird project. All right. And the two prior popes very much saw themselves as certainly part of the West. You can't really even conceive of the West and not think about the Roman Catholic Church, whether you find yourself inside the Roman Catholic Church or on the outside of the Roman Catholic Church, but that Benedict and John Paul II saw themselves as playing, especially in the wake of the various social revolutions of the 60s and 70s, as being a kind of a bulwark or a stay against the kind of confusions in the aftermath of those revolutions. Right. And so, and of course, the biggest two topics that they were most at odds with the sort of the Western consensus had everything to do about sex, right? Had everything to do about sex, marriage, abortion, those kinds of things, those sorts of things. And so now Francis has never said one thing contrary, really, to those things in an official capacity. But I would say the watershed moment for the Pope, the current Pope, was that he was, in fact, on a plane heading to one of his trips somewhere. And they were asking him about homosexuality. And he sort of shrugged his shoulders and basically said, "Who am I to judge?" And I'm sure, as someone who watches the news, Karen, I'm sure you remember that. I mean, it was
Mhm.
about 9.5 years ago, something like this. Well, this was immediately greeted by the Western media establishment and cultural establishment as like, finally, we have a pope who's going to sort of do something about this pesky retrograde, reactionary entity called the Roman Catholic Church, and it'll finally kind of get up to the times. It'll kind of get with it. So now remember, how did that statement happen? Who am I to judge? It wasn't in a document. It wasn't in an encyclical. It wasn't at an audience. It wasn't in any kind of like what we would consider sort of like official capacities. He was just answering questions, interacting with journalists on the plane, right? So how binding is that? And so anyway, but now I won't
Well,
get
and
us.
when he said, "Who am I?" Was he speaking personally, I, or was he speaking I as the pontiff? I think
Exactly.
that's
Yeah.
another question, right?
Right. Right. And
Because
and it's
I could even interpret that as a completely harmless statement
totally
if he's talking about his own personal.
correct.
I mean, I feel the same way. about any issue. Who am I to judge
Right.
anybody,
Right.
right?
Well, and so the answer, that the Catholic Catechism would have given you, it's certainly the one that he had growing up as a kid, as a Catholic, child, is that a reasonable person is the man who is to judge these sorts of things, right? The reasonable, properly oriented, fully integrated person. That's the person who is to judge, right? Now, I would say that there's a sort of
Well,
a double burden.
when they say judge there, do they mean judge or do they mean discern?
Right. Amen. Right. Right. So do they mean like is Jim going to hell because Jim has same-sex attraction? Or what are we even talking about? Right. And so I think those things kind of matter. Like
Well, and also, can a reasonable person a reasonable person can discern
right.
right from wrong based on teaching and so forth, but can a reasonable person judge another person?
Right.
I
Right.
don't
And
think so.
are we talking about ultimate judgment where,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, no, exactly. So, but it doesn't matter, as like these memes have a way of kind of working themselves back into the sort of the cultural matrix. And it doesn't really matter what the Pope meant, what the way that it was interpreted by factions in the church is that the church is going to change. Francis is going to change the church's teachings on human sexuality, right? And there's never been clarification really of what that means, right? So the church has sort of been in this sort of strange, the Roman Catholic Church has been in this very strange kind of ambiguous space for a really long time. And then you start looking at other things. Well, who is the Pope appointing to positions of power and influence? Who is the Pope decommissioning from positions of power and influence, right? So you're left to sort of do all these sorts of things. And so, one wonders about this notion, like, well, in what capacity is the Pope speaking? Now, again, this might bore your audience, but this is a hugely consequential question for Roman Catholics, especially in the wake not only of the Second Vatican Council, but of the First Vatican Council. Of the First Vatican Council was done, I want to say, is in the 1860s and 70s, something like that, right? And I don't have the exact date, so sorry. Somebody can fact check me in the comments. But that in that council, famously and infamously, depending upon your perspective, the dogma of papal infallibility was first promulgated, right?
Oh, that's that late in the history. Oh
Yes,
my goodness.
that
Oh, how
yes,
interesting. Wow.
yeah, and I would, if anybody's interested in this, I can recommend read up on the First Vatican Council. It's very, very interesting and really eye-opening. There's a great book by Timothy O'Malley, I think is his first name, but O'Malley is his last name, and it's just called Vatican One. It's great. It's a great history of sort of what's going on. So, so what does infallibility mean? Right. And so you have some people who have a very sort of high uh, vision of what papal infallibility stands for. You have some people who have a kind of a low view of what papal infallibility means. And it's very difficult to get a sort of a definition of what it actually means. Because the way that I always understood papal infallibility, certainly growing up and certainly in the kind of the context of John Paul II and Benedict XVI, is that it was a sort of a rule facing the current occupant of the chair of St. Peter, meaning that the Pope's responsibility was to teach nothing discordant with church teaching, the dogmatics and the history of the tradition of the church's teaching. Whereas some people interpret that, well, the Pope kind of has what you might call a kind of blank check, right? Sort of, in which you can kind of take the church in the way that you see fit. And so the current fans of Pope Francis have that kind of view. Well, the Pope is, he changed the teaching on the death penalty. He's changing the teaching on divorce and remarriage. And what else is he going to change? And so you have this very interesting dynamic that those people that had considered themselves sort of basically conservative or even traditional had a kind of view of the papacy that was sort of a safeguarding of orthodoxy. But now you have an occupant of the chair of St. Peter, who has a much more active and more constructive view of what papal infallibility could mean, right? So it's this. So your question that sort of kicked me off into this long diatribe. In what capacities does the Pope say anything? It's a question. And it's a problem. It's a real problem, I would say, as a Roman Catholic layman who's trying his best to not only practice his faith but to pass on his faith to his children. It's a real question.
Well,
And so then, sorry, then this brings in the coziness with, let's say, liberation theology. You know, John Paul II and Benedict XVI had a very clear sense of what liberation theology was and why it ran afoul of basic orthodoxy. And now you have someone who maybe is of a different opinion about that. How consequential is that, Karen?
well, why don't you tell people with what John Paul II and Benedict XVI would have said about, well, first of all, from your perspective, what was liberation theology and what would they have said was the problem with liberation theology? If you can do that.
Yeah, I know.
Precisely.
I'm probably going to be somewhat inartful in this, so apologies in advance. But I mean,
Well, I'm
so
putting you on the spot.
that's okay. Hey, I signed up for this, right? So, it's not your fault. As you may remember, of course, Pope John Paul II is Polish, and he was a seminarian through the transfer from Nazi occupation into communist occupation of Poland, and so basically his entire seminary experience was done illegally and secretively, right? So that the relationship between the Polish church and those states, those inimical states, was something that was deeply informative for his both his sort of his own sort of personal formation, but his formation as a priest. And so he was very much motivated by and was Ratzinger after him, but John Paul II was very motivated by the lies that what he would have called the lies of the culture of death. And he would have said one of the chief architects of the culture of death is Marxism, right? And he would include a number of other isms in there, but Marxism was certainly high atop his list, especially since Marxism had so greatly influenced and tortured him and his people. Right. And so he was very much motivated against political Marxism. And I think also philosophical and theological Marxism as well. So much so that when he went to visit some of the South American states in the early 80s, he got into these pretty epic rows with some of the local Jesuits. It should be pointed out, and high-powered churchmen who were sort of playing along with this kind of liberation theology. Now, as always, you have to sort of contextualize this. Well, why would the church have understood its role in part being to be a Marxist in South America? Well, there weren't all bad reasons. There were a lot of good reasons because you had corrupt regimes that had indeed inflicted oppressive policies against native peoples and the poor, and as a sort of a kleptocracy and all of those sorts of things. And I think John Paul's take would have been like, yeah, those things are wrong. Call them wrong, but you don't correct a wrong by importing perhaps an even more malignant wrong in the form of Marxism and communism. So I think he spoke very persuasively against those sort of currents of Marxism in the church because, after all, he grew up and was a young priest and a young bishop inside behind the Iron Curtain. So I think he knew very clearly what it led to, and so he brooked he had no patience for liberation theology, much to the chagrin, remember, of the academic establishment.
Well, my understanding of it too, I mean, my entree into the world of liberation theology was that as a new believer, I was in a church that was very active with missionaries from around the world, and
Right.
missionaries would come frequently to the church and talk to us. And periodically, a missionary would come who was very knowledgeable and would give us a seminar on something. And one of the guys was a missionary from Colombia
Mm,
who was so disturbed by what was happening with liberation theology that he had gone to Oxford and gotten a doctorate in
mm,
liberation theology so that he
mm,
would know the language and would be able to speak into it. And when he was giving us this seminar, my understanding of it was that the Marxists just saw an opportunity. When they began to see the language shift a little bit, they said, ha, that's a language we can use. And they began to twist that language up and then use that language to convert some of the scholars to their side. And then they could take that into the churches and say, see, we are the ones who are really on your side. We're the ones who really understand social justice and want to help the poor. And so they twist all this language, and then they're recruiting guerrillas to go out in the mountains and fight, and
yeah.
so
And,
the church is just disintegrated.
yeah, and a big, an active group of people, involved in that process were the Jesuits, right? Of which Pope Francis is a Jesuit. He's not a secular priest. He's an order priest, right? In other words, he didn't come up through the normal diocesan ranks, but rather was part of a religious order. That's the difference: a religious order versus a secular order. I don't mean secular like secularism. But he is part of the Jesuit order. Now, interestingly enough, he sort of had a reputation earlier on in his career as sort of being against a lot of the excesses of the more ardent, sort of lefty liberation brother priests in his order. But I think I don't know. So I don't know how all that played out, but it was very much part of his formative experience. Now, how do I say this part? I think that the academic institutional Catholicism, like all academic institutions, has not only skews left but has become increasingly left over time. And so John Paul II and Benedict XVI were very much seen as sort of voices counter to that consensus. And so for somebody like me who grew up, like I told you earlier, I sort of read my way back into the faith. I saw in John Paul II and Benedict XVI a necessary corrective to the kind of warmed over leftism that I had received in school, right? So that they were sort of giving voice to a more ancient, more vibrant, more life-giving gospel than the social justice gospel that I had received in school. And so there are just some really interesting kind of wrinkles in the scene, so to speak, right? And so Francis is very much a retro. It's a very much a kind of retro experience for those of us sort of my age and older, because people around my age and older sort of thought that that church of the 70s and 80s, that kind of liberation theology church of the 70s, like we sort of thought it was over. We thought that Benedict and John Paul before him had sort of come and kind of, policed the borders of that stuff and kind of put it on the back burner. And my read on it, and people might accuse me of being uncharitable, but I'm just trying to call balls and strikes. I have no dog in the fight, really. That Francis has resurrected those voices from my childhood, and has uh used them as a kind of way of dismantling the unified response that were embodied in Benedict and John Paul II's papacies. So if you think of them as sort of, if you are a pope, you have a kind of project, right? The project of John Paul II and the project of Benedict XVI were in retrospect an attempt to render the proper interpretation of the Second Vatican Council. So the Second Vatican Councils, if the First Vatican Council takes place in the second half of the 19th century, the Second Vatican Council is convened in early 1960, 61, 62, 63, 64. And it is a multi-year process, and it brings in bishops and cardinals from all around the world. And so this is sort of the opening up, the sort of the two buzzwords you hear in Catholic circles are aggiornamento and which means I'm going to forget the two words here. The two the notion of you have to return to the sources and you have to sort of do a reset, right? Ressourcement and aggiornamento, right? So to go back to the sources is a ressourcement, and aggiornamento is sort of bring up to date. These are the sort of the two buzzwords, right? Now, those are good things, right? Going back to the sources is always a good thing. Updating something for the current moment is a good thing, but it really depends upon how you answered the question. This is what I tweeted out earlier today: is for what, right? Return to the sources for what? Bringing up to date for what? Those are really important questions. And so you had all these sort of forces in the Second Vatican Council. Well, they thought, oh, well, this means that we can kind of scrap all the old stuff that we didn't like, all the old kind of stodgy, unfortunate stuff, and we can sort of create a new church. Benedict and John Paul II, remember, they were sort of, they worked hand in glove for many, many years. They saw the Second Vatican Council not as a break from tradition, but as a kind of an opening up of tradition. Whereas those forces that were working against Benedict and John Paul II, they saw this as a break, not a continuity. And so you see those two buzzwords in Catholic circles. Is the Second Vatican Council a movement of the Holy Spirit of continuity, or is it a movement of the Holy Spirit as a break from the past and a movement into the future? And how you answer that question is hugely consequential. So John Paul II, Benedict, they saw it as continuity. Sure, some things change here and there. We're going to update how we understand certain these things, but the basics have remained the same. The breakers, right? The sort of the discontinuity folks, they see this as a whole new church. And so those forces have now kind of aligned right behind Francis, and they see this as an opportunity to undo the work of Benedict and John Paul II, and to finally bring forth this, this is me saying, the sort of this age of Aquarius church that they always wanted, and those stodgy conservatives never let them have. So that is very much, I think, at the heart of the fight that's going on right now in my church.
The whole thing is just so interesting. So what year was John Paul II?
So he ascended to the papacy in 1978. All right.
Okay.
And
so the changes that the stop that he was trying to put out, that probably took a few years for that to kind of percolate out through the church. Yep. Okay, so I became a Christian in 1980. I'm in this little country church.
Yep.
And the pastor's wife had a women's Bible study. And she invited all the ladies in the neighborhood to be part of this women's Bible study. And more Catholic ladies were coming to this women's Bible study because they were so disturbed by what had been happening in the church from this Second Vatican Council thing. I didn't know at that time that that's what they were disturbed by.
Right.
But they were coming in, and then they were becoming Christian.
Yeah. No, I know. I know exactly what you're
talking
about.
In this Bible study and converting into this little church. And I had some very dear friends that were very involved with me in the movement to save education back in the early 1980s. We were working. I knew them politically, not by faith. Then I became a Christian, and they were part of the Catholic Church. They had a bunch of kids and just really great people, but they were so disturbed by what was happening in the church.
Yeah, the iconoclasm of that era is really underrated in how disruptive it was to sort of the normal world.
Oh, it must have been, because I invited these people to come to church with me one Sunday, and they were so struck by the evidence of the Holy Spirit
That's
in
right.
our
That's right.
midst, right?
Yeah,
And
that's right.
and then that whole family converted
Yeah.
into this little church that we were in.
Yeah.
And to this day, all the kids from that family are evangelicals, and they all have their families and their kids and their worship leaders and their
Mhm.
Bible
Mhm.
teachers and so forth.
Mhm.
So whatever happened in the Catholic Church with the Second Vatican Council had a very destructive power on the rank and file members
Yes.
who just
And
felt like
remember,
they had to go someplace where they could find Christ again.
that's right. And remember, most people didn't read the documents of the Second Vatican Council. Their experience of the council is what they saw in the newspaper reports, and really most significantly is the alterations to the liturgy, right? Prior to 1966, let's say, every mass around the world was done in Latin, right? And after 66, and there's a whole process of this, it sort of officially gets promulgated and then it sort of gets carted out. But basically by 1969, let's call it, the not only is the mass not in Latin anymore, it's in the local vernacular, which is, whatever, fine. But the whole ethos of the thing radically changes. Radically changes. And so in some places that was done, handled well, but most places it was done, again, I keep going back to this word radical, like it's totally different. And not only that, you have an entire culture of like nuns and priests and brothers that sort of behave one way, 2 years ago, and now it's completely different. No habits, no cassocks,
Yeah, yeah, I
no,
saw all those changes.
all that stuff, right? And yes, I can sit here and intellectually kind of walk you through the process of why that's not a big deal and blah, 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 blah. But in terms of like the lived reality of that, all of a sudden you went through this very thick world where everything kind of made sense and everything was kind of in its place, basically. And there were problems. I'm not a sentimentalist about these sorts of things. To all of a sudden, this sort of radical reorientation where you've got people like dancing at church and guitars at church, and the priest is leaving the priesthood and running off with Sister Jane, and like it's really wacky. I mean, it reminds me, honestly, it reminds me of the kind of evocative stories that you hear like about the French Revolution, like crazy stuff. And I think for most people, like your friends, they're like kind of looking at all this sort of stuff, be like, well, this is nuts. And so I want to go back. I want to find a place where I can, be connected to the spirit, walk with Jesus and raise my family. Like it's not complicated, and so I'm
Yeah,
not
even
surprised at
even
all.
though even though there were guitars at our church.
Yeah, yeah, no, but again, no, I know, and I like guitars, they're fine, but I'm just talking about the change of that is such a radical thing that at least my mom talks about this, because she was very fortunate, as she would say, is that she found a group of charismatic Catholic. A charismatic Catholic community through which she was able to sort of keep attached to Christ, but and that sort of remained her North Star, and all the other stuff. It was what it was, but she
Yeah,
had her kind of North Star there. I think a
yeah.
lot of people were not so fortunate, as your friends, I think, are a perfect example of. And so you've
Well,
got a
and,
whole
and then
contingent in the
I had
church.
a lot of friends that were part of the Catholic charismatic movement, and very, very deeply meaningful relationships I had with all those friends. So
Mhm.
yeah, there
Well,
was
that
something
you would
really
have
great going on
you'd
there.
love my mom. I mean, that's
Yeah,
my mom's speech right there.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, let's go back to this idea about the
Yeah,
individualism. Jordan Peterson's tweet said, if I recall, um, salvation is not a matter of social justice, but a matter of the redemption of the individual, something like that.
yeah.
The salvific redemption of the individual. So anyway, he was using very religious language for someone who's
He's apparently not
not
a
religious
Christian.
himself.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, I don't know. I've listened to him a lot, and I've listened to him a lot lately in the last couple of years, and I've
Mhm.
seen a big shift in his language and in his demeanor when he talks about Christ. So I have no idea. But anyway, back to this idea of the individual. You said, I think that you don't believe that he means the kind of hyper individualism that people were reacting to. the Western educated, industrialized,
Yeah.
rich, democratic version of individualism,
Right. Right.
right?
I don't think he does. Again, for me, when I listen to Jordan Peterson, I'm always, what's always at the forefront of my imagination is that, he was really, I mean, if you look at the way he talks about the genesis of his entire intellectual project, right? And it has always been as what would make people act so disgusting and devil like, that the gulag and the concentration camps were, not only stomached but seen as good things. So I'm always looking at what he says in that context. And so my reading of his, now look, a lot of people in this corner, Paul maybe even included, will say that Jordan Peterson is desperately trying to hold on to modernism. I I get what they're saying, but I think he's trying to reclaim, a better a better individualism, an individualism that is much more ancient because you listen to a lot of Peterson, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I could hear him saying like, well, it depends upon what you mean by individual, right? I mean, as the sort of the classic Peterson meme would go, right? Well, what do you mean by an individual? Like, well, when you hear him talking about an
Well, every
individual,
individual is nested in
exactly,
it, right?
exactly, nested, and there are many Kales, right? And that there's a sort of a kind of executive Kale, perhaps, right, that sort of operates all these sub Kales, right, in terms of making them work. And so therefore even the individual is a kind of a community, I think he would say. And so you're already dealing with the more than one from the get-go. So then what might we ask? I mean, maybe nobody's really done this game. Well, Karen, when you hear Jordan Peterson talk about the individual, what do you hear him to mean?
Well, I hear him saying that the in order to be an integrated individual, you have to be nested in a community because your plans should include having an intimate partner
Yeah.
and then having children with that intimate
Right.
partner. And if for some reason that's not possible to have an intimate partner or to, then at least you're nested in the community of your parents and your sisters and your brothers. And that within that community, you're working together to try to make your local neighborhood a better place. And that within the neighborhood, you're looking to be good citizens in
Yeah.
your community. And then the community, and it goes out from there. But you
Yeah.
start with the individual because if you start with the community, you're not really connected to, you're not doing anything. You're just part of this ethos of the community, but
Or or
it
or
has
or,
to
or
come back to
maybe
action, right?
you're just like a part of a machine.
Yeah.
And so I do read a lot of sort of anti the machine sort of spirit in Peterson. You know, I there was a funny clip of Peterson. This was early on. This is what I think it was during his first book tour, and he was talking about The Simpsons, and he was talking about sacrifice, and he was talking about Homer. And Homer, at some point, eats like an entire jar of mayonnaise, and somebody's like, Dad, like, what do you do? What do you do? And he's like, Oh, no, no, that's not my problem. That's a problem for future Homer, right? And I always made me laugh because I'm a huge Simpsons fan. But it is also it's true, right? So that Peterson is trying to understand the individual both as a sort of collection of sub personalities in the moment, but also in the individual scaled out over time, right? So that his joke about future Homer is like, well, duh, you're future Homer, right? You just don't know it yet. So the point the point about his focus on the individual, I think, is that and look, think about, the class insistence on, clean your room, right? Well, why, right? Why would that be, something that you do, right? So, and or I was thinking of this morning on my run, I was thinking of the rule, treat yourself as if you were somebody worthy of being saved. I forget exactly how the rule goes, but
Worthy of being taken care of. Yeah.
that's it. Right, right. It's like, well, why? Why is it easier for me to take care of you, Karen, than it is for me to take care of myself? Right. And so even if you get into sort of the inner workings of these rules, he's always dealing with the community, that nested community that you keep talking about. So then, going back to the tweet, why is he punching up at Pope Francis's account, in which Pope Francis is using the kind of the language of collectivism? To me, he's punching up at this language of collectivism, is because when you use your language in a lazy fashion this way, bad stuff happens. And, and like gulags happen, right? I mean, like that sort of thing. And then maybe too, with this sort of this language of collectivism, what about the bad that comes about through that employment of collectivism versus the sanctity of the individual? Do we believe that the individual is sacred? I think we do.
Well, isn't that what you clipped out from the Pope today?
Yeah.
Every human person is sacred and inviolable.
Right.
To ensure that a society has a future, it is necessary that a sense of respect be matured for the dignity of every person, no matter in what condition they find themselves.
Yeah.
Now, there's a lot buried in there. I mean, he's saying a lot,
Yeah.
but to start with, to say every human person is sacred and inviolable, I was sort of raised by, at least since I've become a Christian and read things and tried to understand historical fact and everything else, that part of our tradition, at least here in this country, is, leave no man behind.
Right.
Every single individual counts. That's what differentiates, or in the past at least has differentiated our military from other militaries, is that a military man is not just part of the machine. He's not just important because he is a fighter.
Right.
He is a human being, an individual, and his life is worth saving. So even if you sacrifice your own life on his behalf, you've done a valuable thing to save that person. And so every individual counts. And that, to me, that's my understanding of individual, as opposed from the state being the center of everything.
Right.
So, right.
Yeah, right. So yeah. So in other words, if I'm understanding you correctly, that the dignity and the sacredness and the inviolability of each and every individual comes not from the state, but it comes from the fact, the miracle that Peterson calls it in a different context, that we are all made in the image and likeness of God.
Yes.
Right. And he's been insistent upon that. I mean, I've never heard him not talk about the miracle. I mean, he calls it, in many contexts, he calls it a miracle of civilization, that he says is not at all self-evident, that we are made in the image and likeness of God. And so this is the guy, right, Karen? Like, this is the guy who sends out that tweet. So my reaction to it is like, well, let's try to understand what triggered Jordan, because I know he believes in the sacredness of individuals. He believes in the nested reality. I don't know.
Well, and I mean, I heard Paul say something on that live stream yesterday. I think he was talking with Nate.
Okay.
But Paul made the comment that, he thinks Jordan is still trying to maintain his visibility, and, that part of the reason he does things is so that, and part of the reason that he interviews the people he does is that they're high profile and it keeps his profile high and everything. Well, okay, maybe, fair enough. I don't know. I tend to not think that. I try not to think that way about people. I try not, and I'm not, this is no accusation against Paul.
Yeah, that's
I'm just saying that struck me funny, because I would like to give Jordan Peterson as much leeway as I would give anybody else, not trying to assume that they're doing something for some particular reason.
All right. Okay. Like
For
Karen.
me, part of Jordan Peterson's reason for what he does is that he really cares about people, and he thinks the best way to help people is to help them
clean their room.
find truth, be informed, but with actual truth, and not be informed with this murky thing that's happening now where nobody knows where to find truth because the news is all suspect and everything is suspect. And so the best way to keep that truth out there is through talking to people who have pieces of the truth and keep trying to build the picture. I don't see him with some underlying, oh, I want to be famous and have a lot of money and keep my profile high. And, I just don't see it.
I don't think that's the primary vector either. How about this? I mean, I've noticed this thing, he said something like this before, as has like Douglas Murray. There's this annoyance on the part of non-Christians who are sympathetic to the Christian project, but for whatever reason can't bring themselves across, fully on board, something like that.
Yeah.
That they want the church to be weird, right? It's that old Malcolm Muggeridge thing, right? That you want the church to be weird, you want the church to be true to itself, maybe is a way to put it, because the world doesn't need another UN. Sorry, the world doesn't need another NGO. The world needs the church to be the church. And I wonder if this is Peterson sort of throwing a shot across the bow, being like, Pope, like, do you know who you are? I mean, this is sort of what we were talking about earlier. Like, you're not even some just like rando bishop in Argentina. You're the Pope of the world. What are you doing? What are you doing using this kind of lazy language that has been weaponized and used against people for a long time now? Like, what are you doing?
So in a way, he was actually showing a deep respect for the office of Pope.
Well, I wonder that. I do. That's sort of where I went in my own head. And I'm like, I'm cognizant of the fact that people, like, well, Kale, how come you're not extending the same charity to the Pope? And that's fair. I very much have sort of thought that in my head. And I think it's because, and this is why I brought up, the Pope's account versus the Pope. Jordan Peterson's Twitter account is Jordan Peterson, warts and all, right? The Pope's account is not the Pope's account. Not the way that you and I operate our Twitter account, right? I don't know about you, Karen, but I don't have a team of operatives who are busy like tweeting out these really bad tweets, all day long and all evening long. No, that's me, warts and all. Like, sometimes they're good and sometimes they're bad. Sometimes I'm a jerk and sometimes I'm not. I'm working on it, right? But I think that is an operative part of this conversation. And should the Pope have a Twitter account? I mean, the fiction is that it's the Pope and he's there, like, like I knew that it was Donald Trump's Twitter account, right? And I certainly would like, really, this is what we're doing? Like, sometimes I would laugh, sometimes I would cry, sometimes I'd be disgusted, sometimes I'd be like, what is Covfefe? I don't, so I think it's like that. Like, what does it mean? Because I think Jordan would understand, that whoever sits in the chair, whether you're a Catholic or not, whoever sits in that chair, you darn sure want to make sure that that is not a frivolous person. You darn sure want to make sure that the people who are running that account are not frivolous, small-minded, craven little, courtiers, right? You want people who take that stuff seriously. Because you and I can sit here and dissect a tweet, for whatever, an hour and a half that we've been going here, right? But some people are just going to sort of take it just what it is. Like, oh yeah, hashtag social justice. Like, that's good. Like, that's potentially irresponsible.
Well, yes. And I mean, all the language of that tweet was of that sort, where it could have been taken 5 different ways, depending on which side you're looking at. but it's the kind of language that speaks directly to the heart of the project that wants to make everything a collective and
Right.
wants to remove us from, to get us as far as possible from the source,
Right.
and to put us in a position where all our virtue needs to be only whatever we tweet and not what we actually do. And I mean, there is a tribe that loves that kind of language, and that if they can get you to use that language,
Right.
well, and even if that tribe didn't exist, and in some, here I am having a judgment against somebody after I just said I wouldn't have judgments against people. All you have to do is go back to like Orwell. Orwell had this wonderful essay once on why we should not use cliches.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
is. Have you ever read it?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it's so
This is
beautiful. Well, that's exactly the reason why we shouldn't use that kind of language, because it's language that's completely had all the good meaning sucked out of it. And now it's just language that's useful to make tools out of people.
right. And I would say this just as sort of a warning to people, and I include myself in this warning, as be very, and this I think is, we've had these conversations in this little corner, right? I mean, there are esoteric things that happen in subgroups, right? And peculiarities in which the way you use language, right? And I think it's always important for you to be aware of the peculiar ways in which you use language, over and against the sort of the general assumed meaning of shared language, right? And of course any subgroup can use language how they see fit, but always always be aware of how that language can be heard. And Paul talked about this just yesterday, the day before, that as a pastor he's very much aware of how his words are going to be heard versus how his words are meant. And I think that that's a good heuristic model, to have, that, to be aware of, when you use, sorry, this is Kale speaking, leftist pablum, under the account called pontifex, right? Understand the potential downstream consequences of how that language is going to be weaponized, right? And so I think, I don't know, that's sort of where I land. I land on that.
Well, okay, so let's end with this then, because
Mhm.
we started with and haven't gotten there yet, the idea of social justice.
Right.
Um, that is the kind of language that can easily be misunderstood. And yet there's a whole quadrant in this little corner
Mhm.
that fully got on board with the idea of social justice, because to them it means something different. So, what does social justice mean within the broader Catholic Church in terms of Catholic social teaching? And then, um, I mean, maybe there are
Yeah.
some people who don't understand why social justice is triggering to you and me. And so maybe you could
Mhm.
say social justice triggers because of this, but this is what
Mhm.
it means in larger Catholic teaching.
I mean, that's a big question. I would say that
You have
the
3 minutes.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I know, I know. I gotta go bring my
I'm
daughter
kidding.
to.
I'm
I
kidding.
have to go bring my daughter to driver's ed.
Oh, okay.
Um, the I think I'm I prefer justice,
I
right?
do too, yeah.
And I think that using appending social to the word invites opportunities to manipulate that. Now, again, in the tradition, in Catholic social teaching, there's a tradition of this, but I think it's a recognition that the city of God is different than the city of man, and that we are preparing ultimately for a forever existence in the city of man. Sorry, in the city of God. And so that we have an opportunity here in earth time to practice. I mean, I think that's the part we mean when we say we practice our faith. We have an opportunity to practice and prepare ourselves to sing Sanctus, Sanctus, Sanctus in perpetuity with God and the heavenly host. And so we have a certain responsibility to open up those spaces in the here and now to practice for that existence. and to work toward that. I am just deeply suspicious of centralized, bureaucratized power used in such a way. I think it tends to end badly, and so I'm a minimalist, and I mean this might be something where me and Nate actually probably come together on, is that I'm way more sympathetic to sort of a kind of Christian anarchism than I ever was before, in part because I'm just deeply suspect of people who would use social justice as a way of capturing the means of production in that kind of Marxist idiom. And so I think the church always is going to understand that Christ first, and that then becomes the sort of the point by which we orient everything else. If you cut Jesus out of that equation, then it's a recipe for tyranny.
So social justice became a shortcut. You have justice, the biblical justice, and then you had Catholic social teaching. And
Mhm.
somebody somewhere along the line got the idea, well, we could just shortcut and not have to say Catholic social teaching and justice.
Right,
We could just say social justice.
right,
But that fell right into the pocket of liberation theology, about which much more could be said. I should probably do a
for
whole
sure.
episode on liberation theology.
Yeah, and if I could recommend, I think a great corrective to a hyper individualist model, which again, I don't think that this is where Jordan Peterson is coming from, but I think a great corrective to this idea was actually written by Cardinal Ratzinger. It's a piece called "Spe Salve," in Hope We Are Saved is the name of the encyclical, and he gets into this sort of hyper individualism as a sort of a bug of post French Revolution thought that I think is very worthy of a kind of corrective to the kind of social justice, that triggers the two of us, and certainly
Mhm.
triggered Gavin yesterday. I think that so that there is in fact a need to sort of remember the community and the individual as being in a kind of tension, and an important and necessary tension to preserve, rather than sort of going all one way or all the other. So I think it's more about preserving that tension. But anyway, I can send you the link, Karen.
That would be
It's
great. I'd love to
wonderful.
put that in the notes. I'd love to
Yeah.
read it myself, because I think one of the big issues that we face is the way that education has glossed over the differences between the American Revolution and the French Revolution.
Oh, yeah.
That was a huge divide, and it's completely been covered over. And there are I know a lot of young people who think, wow, French Revolution, great. They have no idea.
Well, it's funny. I'm literally in the class that I teach. I'm about to teach for the next month on the French Revolution, so it's very much on my brain right now. It's
Well, if
very different than the
if
American
you have the
Revolution.
time in the future, I'd love to have that
Yeah,
conversation.
yeah,
So,
no, that'd be great.
yeah, okay, you got to go. I got to go. This has
I do,
been
Karen. It's been
perfect.
great. Thank you for having me on. Hopefully, I made some sense. We'll see.
No, it
So,
was very stimulating. Thank you.
all right, you take care.
Bye
Bye bye.
bye.